Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the jaunty 60s jazz I had going today. That's the mood I'm in. It's lovely to see you all this morning, and I see a couple people on my screen that I got the chance to see yesterday too. It's so nice to spend multiple days in a row with you guys. Kelly, Heather, Ryan, I see you all on my screen. Good morning, welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. We are in 9:02, so we're just gonna jump right in. Let me get all my correct screens up. Okay. Um, just in case you don't know who I am yet, you probably do and are tired of my introduction, but in case you're joining for the first time today, for whatever reason, I'm Namisha Thakur, Director of Academics here at TNTP, coming to you today from Dallas, Texas, which is my hometown. And I'll pass it off to Nadia and then Abby for some super quick introductions.
Good morning. My name is Nadia Nibs. I'm located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are set to get our snow finally later today. So let's see what happens. It's great seeing some of you 2 days in a row and excited for the content that we have for you today.
Morning, y'all. Abby Robinson, Senior Manager for TNTP, coming to you all from Chicago, and also set to get quite a bit of snow, maybe today, maybe this weekend at some point. I'll be supporting with tech today, so if you guys have any tech issues, feel free to pop it in the chat and I will do my best to support you all.
And on that note, if you need a link or something throughout the session and you want to direct message one of us, you'll probably get a quicker response if you direct message Abby. Nadia and I do our best to manage the chat, but while we're facilitating, it's hard to like get you a link or get you on Google Classroom, whatever. So Abby's going to be your go-to for all of that. Alrighty, some housekeeping, and let's give everybody a couple of minutes to just get settled and ready to go here. So as always, we are going to be pretty high tech today, so we want to take some time up front to get situated. We're going to drop a couple of links in the chat again for the sign in and session materials. Please, please do make sure that you've signed in so that we have a record of your attendance today. And then go ahead and download or make a copy of the participant handout. You can find this posted to Google Classroom or in the folder that's linked in the chat. Once you've signed in and you have all of today's materials open and ready to go, take a minute to update your Zoom username with your school, district, or ESU in parentheses. If you are physically in a room with other people, more than 2 people, and you're calling in on one Zoom line, just make sure your username reflects that and tells us that you're like how many people are in the room with you. This will just help us out with breakout rooms later. So when we do breakouts, if you have multiple people in person with you, you can stay in the main room and just converse with each other. I'm going to pause here for a minute just to give everybody some time to get through all of these housekeeping pieces, sign in, get that handout open, and update your Zoom username. If you need anything over the next minute, just drop a note in the chat. Alrighty, moving right along. So our goal for today is at the broadest level going to be to balance supporting people in this group who are newer to coaching while also pushing those of us who have a little more coaching experience. So to do that over the next 3 hours, we're going to do the following. We'll investigate the role of inquiry in coaching and how it can be leveraged as a tool for instructional change. We will discuss how to identify narrow priorities in classrooms for development. And we'll practice using an inquiry approach to pave the way for breakthroughs in coaching conversations. Knowing that that's what we're covering today, with that in mind, take a minute to skim over our norms. They're the same as always, and share in the chat which one or two you want to prioritize for yourself, considering where you are in your own mental headspace and considering the content we're covering today. What do you want to prioritize? Thank you guys so much for sharing in the chat. Okay, we love an icebreaker, so we're gonna start with that. We're all coming off of holiday breaks and various holidays, or if you're like me, the holidays feel like a lifetime ago already, but they really weren't that long ago. So we're gonna take some time right now to agree or disagree with some holiday hot takes. In one by one, we're gonna show what we think is a hot take. And we'd love for you to share in the chat if you agree or disagree with each of the hot takes. And if you have any strong feelings or other hot takes, feel free to share that in the chat as well. All right, are we ready? Hot take number one, Christmas trees and other Christmassy decorations should not go up before Thanksgiving. Ooh, I'm seeing the chat popping. Agree. Lots of agree. Interesting. Thanksgiving is just pre-Christmas. I think I also disagree. I'm sort of the mindset of like, do it when you have time. And if that happens to be the weekend before Thanksgiving, then so be it. All right, hot take number two. Turkey has to be on the Thanksgiving table. Otherwise, it's not Thanksgiving. Melanie said no. I want to hear from a couple people. You can come off mute or you can share in the chat. If you disagree with this, what do you have on your Thanksgiving table instead?
I'll come off mute. I will have anything on my Thanksgiving table that someone is making for me. I don't care if it's not turkey.
Prime rib. We're into ribs here. All right. I disagree with this simply because I'm vegetarian. So there will be no meat on my Thanksgiving table. I love a good veggie lasagna. I love to make green bean casserole. That's what I eat for Thanksgiving. Okay. Opinion number three. A gift card isn't a real gift during the holidays. I think everyone agrees on this one, or everyone's disagreeing with this one. We're all on the same page, except for Danielle Roby. All right, interesting. Okay, hot take number 4. Sugar cookies are better than gingerbread. I love seeing the random, like, all caps. People got suddenly really strong feeling. I agree with this. I'm not a big gingerbread fan. I mean, I don't dislike it, but I don't particularly love it. Like, I'll eat it if it's there. All right. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to share a hot take to get others' opinions? Going once, going twice. Any hot takes out there?
I just want to say, every time I feel like I know the crowd in Nebraska, y'all surprise me. So this chat has been very, very fun this morning.
Oh, okay. We got 2 good ones here. First, is re-gifting okay? Agree or disagree? Re-gifting is okay. Yes, Kara, very important to a different crowd. Let's not be re-gifting things back to people who gifted us. Love it. Okay, and then we had one more. This is not an agree or disagree, but let's just hear, when do Christmas decorations come down? Do we have feelings about that? When I have time, yes. Oh my, Heather, afternoon of December 25th. All right, all right. I'm definitely a first week of January kind of person, or like right before the new year. Great. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Love the hot takes. We're gonna come back to this idea of hot takes in a couple of slides. Whenever Nadia plans an icebreaker, there's always like a thematic conceptual connection, even if at first you're like, what the heck? How does this relate to anything? But we'll come back to it. But let's kind of recap where we've been, our journey a little bit before we get into new content. So we are officially at the halfway point of our year of learning together. Take 30 seconds right now before I say anything further to skim over our objectives from session 1, session 2, and our regional site visits. So to kind of sum this up, in our first session all the way back in September, we dug into what we mean when we say strong instruction. And we did that by kind of grounding in TNTP's core rubric. And we talked about the role that coaching can play in helping to make progress toward that vision for strong instruction. In session 2, we discussed at a very high level the components of a coaching cycle. And we practiced taking low inference notes. And we started talking about how to identify coaching action steps for teachers based on the student level change needed in their classrooms. And then finally, when we last gathered, we saw many of you in person, which was such a lovely experience for our regional site visits. And thank you again to our gracious host schools. During those site visits, we applied our learning from the first 2 sessions to practice using the core rubric to take low inference notes, and then norming on the characteristics and components of strong instruction. I want to go back to one of our objectives from session 2, because we're going to talk more about this today. In session 2, when we reviewed and reflected on the feedback survey responses that you all shared at the end of the session, we realized that maybe we stayed a bit too high level for this last objective around thinking through action steps, basically. And as a result, there were some lingering misunderstandings, we think, about how to approach and facilitate coaching conversations that we want to dig into a little bit more today. So we do read every single survey comment closely, and we do use your feedback to plan for these sessions. So first and foremost, thank you so much to those of you who shared thoughtful, honest reflections in that CSI Session 2 survey, because it really helped inform the direction we're taking today. So we want to share some of the comments with you all from the survey. We're going to keep it totally anonymous, but we want to share some comments that reflect a trend that we noticed, that to us told us that maybe some folks left Session 2 feeling a little bit uncomfortable about giving teachers direct feedback in coaching conversations. So first, I'm just going to give us a minute to read over 3 comments from the survey. Again, totally anonymous. You don't need to like name or suggest if it's you unless you want to. These comments we feel like illustrate the trend that we saw. So take a minute to read over these comments and feel free to share in the chat what tension or concern you're noticing in these comments. Really bad at gauging how much time people need to read. So I hope that was enough time. If it's not, let me know in the chat. But for us, when we read comments like these, this gave us some really useful insight into how some of us sort of think about instructional coaching at a philosophical level. And how some of what we shared in Session 2 around action steps for teachers may have felt dissonant or perhaps misaligned to your core beliefs about coaching. After all, if you are someone who firmly believes in teacher agency, perceiving our message in Session 2 to be something like, tell teachers what to work on, might not feel particularly good, right? That wasn't our intent, but that could have been how it came off, right? So this feedback told us there are a couple of things that we need to own and address today. First, we perhaps moved too quickly through some of the integral messaging in Session 2, missing some opportunities to clarify what we mean, which is not, in fact, that we should all go be just directly telling teachers what to do all the time. And secondly, we didn't perhaps spend enough time exploring other schools of thought when it comes to approaches to coaching. So today, we want to be responsive to this feedback. We hope that our in-person walkthroughs in November added some nuance, but we don't want to make assumptions. So we're going to take some intentional time today to really dig into different coaching stances and approaches to coaching.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So to kick off our time together and build some of that context, we're actually going to transition into some of that pre-work, right? That collaborative time that we wanted to start our day off with today. So as part of your pre-work, we had to read, annotate, and reflect on an article and come prepared to discuss it with colleagues. So in your participant handout, there are has directions as well as the roles for discussion groups while you're in breakout rooms. Before we transition to breakout rooms, we're just going to preview those 4 roles together pretty quickly on the next slide. So just take 1 minute, 30 seconds. Let's just take 30 seconds, scan the slides just to get the gist of the 4 different roles. Yep, as you can see, there's a timekeeper, reporter, manager, evidence manager, and discussion manager. And as soon as you're together in your breakout rooms, you know, first you're going to introduce yourselves, read over the logistics, and assign your roles. Try not to spend more than 2 minutes on this initial setup so that you can jump right into discussion. You'll be pulled back into this main room after about 15 minutes. Now, again, remember that if you are in a physical room with other people, you can totally have this discussion and discourse with the folks in your physical room. Just stay in the main room so we can make sure breakout rooms always have people that they can talk to and who are present in the Zoom. So with that, I'll give you about 30 seconds to orient, get your pre-work out as we did at the beginning, make sure it's ready and available. And at this time, we're gonna go ahead and open breakout rooms for discussion. Okay. Hope you all had fantastic dynamic conversations. Welcome back. We know that did not feel long enough at all, but hopefully it was enough time to at least dig into some juicy conversations about the text. And maybe also practice, you know, some things that we haven't done in a while, like cite evidence, go back to the text, etc. So we had just some like post discussion share out. We're not going to go group by group in the interest of time, but we do want to open the floor, especially our reporters. You know, you can feel free to, if there's something that you're excited to share a whole group, we'd love for you to come off mute, share a little bit about what your room discussed. And then specifically would love to hear any folks' responses to these 3 questions that are projected. So to what extent does this article capture the ways you think about instructional coaching currently? If you're a new coach, what takeaways would you have about directive coaching specifically? But then also opening up, what were your biggest takeaways from the discussion? So I'm handing it over to you.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
wait, go ahead. No, you go ahead. You're free.
One thing that I think about instructional coaching currently is really understanding the state of where teachers are and how the different strategies might apply to teachers at different times. So depending on where they're at in their state of mind or what they're thinking about, or, you know, any of those concepts are really going to determine which type of coaching you're utilizing at that time. I think there's areas for all of it. And I think it's really based on, like, you need to build that relationship and understand the teachers to their core in order to be able to make some of those decisions. But I think there has to be a relationship built to be able to do any of those effectively.
The biggest takeaways from our group were with the directive coaching is that you're viewed as the expert and that you should have the answers. And it takes ownership away from the teacher. If you're saying, this is what you need to do, and then if it doesn't work, then the teacher's like, well, that was your idea anyway. Like, so the directive approach was one that kind of seemed like a last option for a lot of us, and more of a to help somebody who needs to improve and they can't do it themselves.
Our group talked a lot about how as new coaches, there were 3 of us in the group that were brand new to this year. And we talked about how directive coaching relies on expertise to be shared. And as people who are new to this, in our previous work, in our previous classrooms, we were seen as the experts. So sometimes it's natural for a new coach to lean into that because they had been experts in their room. And you do get teachers who sit down with you who are asking, please just tell me what to do. So you naturally fall into like a directive approach. And then at what point do teachers maybe become too reliant on that directive approach where they sort of shut down to the idea of like, actually, I can think through this myself or with a thinking partner because I do have some knowledge and skills.
And our group, we talked, I'm gonna go to the facilitative because everything you've said about directive coaching, we agreed with, but we said that facilitative is probably the most difficult because it's hard to know which questions to ask to probe their thinking. So it's a great approach, but it's also very difficult for the coach to do. I think it takes more practice and experience for that type of coaching than the other 2.
I just wanna, that really resonates with me, Kristen, because it just made me realize, like, I think it can be easy to assume that facilitative might be easier because you don't have to have the answers, but it actually does, to your point, take a lot of intention and thoughtfulness around asking like the just right questions. So thank you for naming that. That gave me something to think about.
We had Ryan in our group, and we had talked similar about what everybody said. He just I like what he pushed back on the thinking that administrators can't be coaches, and challenged us a little bit with that, and that there's a way to do it, and it can be done. So this is a brief conversation about that, but I thought it's a good point. It's easy to forget that. So
we talked about here at UMPS how at times there's both of these approaches that are happening within a coaching cycle. And so when we look there, I think it's tough to say that directive coaches assume that teachers don't know the practices or know what they're using. And I don't think that's always the case. Like in directive coaching, it may be that they forgot a component or there's some other hypothesis that we've come to determine that. And within the coaching conversation itself and setting up the cycle, there's a lot of facilitative work that happens given teachers choice of what that coaching cycle is going to look like. And so we just really talked about how we try to use a little bit of a blend with some of those depending on the approach, the teacher, what we rolled out to that component and what that's going to look like moving forward. So
I would agree. We just talked a lot about how there might be situations in which all of the different types of coaching are appropriate. For example, like for me, there's times where it's directive. The principal says, I need you to go coach this person on this. And so then it is a little bit more directive versus a teacher reaching out and saying, hey, I want to try this new thing. Can you come watch and help? Which I'm just there to help and that's it, not necessarily give ideas or anything. So just all different types and different situations.
Awesome. We're going to wrap up our whole group share in about the next 90 seconds. So if there's any last words anyone wants to share or pushes, we welcome them at this time.
I think for me, because I've been a coach for the last like 5 or 6 years-ish, some part-time, some full-time, and I've had so many resources that have been great, like Jim Knight, Elena Aguilar. We've had cognitive coaching. Our new AP is really pushing this directive approach also, like to support some of our brand new teachers. And so I think for me, having these almost categorized was nice, because like we can find these like nuances within all three of these things, and it can be like fluid here and there. And we landed on there's no silver bullet for all of this, and it really does depend on the relationship you have. And so I don't know, it was just nice to have these like three little categories, and then like kind of figuring out like where all of these resources fall within there. So
Well, that's a great segue, because hopefully that means you're really going to enjoy this session, because we get a little bit even more fine tooth, right? When you think about combing through what are some options, what are some stances, how do we do some of the finessing of coaching? We got some practice, we got some role play, we got a video featuring 2 superstars. So hopefully today's session feels juicy and engaging, and like it will continue to add to your coaching toolbox. So with that, we would love for you all to take a quick 5-minute break. Thank you so much for your engagement, for digging in, for discussing. We'll see you back here at 9:55.
All right, we will go ahead and jump into our next section. Thank you all, to echo Nadia. Thank you guys for sharing. Before the break, it was really insightful to pop into some of the breakout rooms, and loved hearing honest reflections from people in all roles. I heard ESU folks, school leaders, district folks, like everyone sharing like honestly and vulnerably. So thank you for continuing to create that kind of collaborative environment. And we hope that you found the time discussing the article to be valuable. We're going to keep talking about it and hopefully answer some of the questions that may have come up in your conversations. So what we're going to do now is take a few minutes to stamp our key takeaways and drive home a few critical ideas around all coaching as dialogical. To start with, we're going to ground in this quote from Elena Aguilar, the author of The Art of Coaching. Can I get, let's see, who am I going to call on? Amy Walters. Can you come off mute and read out this quote for us?
When you take a facilitative stance in coaching, you hold up a mirror and ask them what they see. When you take a directive stance in coaching, you're holding up the mirror in front of them and saying, look at this funny hair sticking straight up right here. What do you want to do about it? A transformational coach uses both facilitative and directive coaching strategies. One stance is not better, both are needed.
Thank you. And hopefully that echoes some of what you guys were sharing that I heard in various breakouts, and what we heard in the whole group share out too. There's not, to the way Danielle said it, I think was there's not a silver bullet, right? It varies. So we're going to dig into that concept even further here. So traditionally, and kind of as we saw in the article that we read for pre-work, coaching can be framed as sort of 3 distinct types of coaching, which is what we saw how Dr. Knight was describing it in his article, right? In directive coaching, the coach is the holder of answers and tells the teacher what to do and how to do it, based on the assumption that the teacher does not have their own knowledge to bring to the table. Directive coaching then is a very prescriptive approach. Facilitative coaching is quite the opposite, right? Here, the coach never offers any input or advice based on the assumption that the teacher does have knowledge and experiences to bring to the table already, and they just maybe need some inquiry and a line of questioning to reach that change. And then he describes dialogic coaching as balancing these 2 approaches, right? Asking questions and sharing ideas with the teacher toward the goal for development. Often we hear directive coaching described in a way that can sort of give it a bad rap, right? So in the article, we saw quotes like this one. However, directive coaching deprofessionalizes teaching by minimizing teacher expertise and autonomy, and therefore frequently engenders resistance. Statements like this they can be a little bit sort of reductionist and paint directive coaching as something to avoid entirely, right? If you were brand new to coaching and read an article like this, why would you want to incorporate any directive coaching in your practice if it's described in this kind of way, right? If it's described as something to avoid. On the other hand, we often see facilitative coaching described as having a lot of redeeming qualities, but the way it's framed can also end up sometimes creating a bit of a binary, right? Like in this example, and someone called it out earlier in the whole group discussion. The way facilitative coaching is described in the article we read is that facilitative coaching works best when the teachers being coached already have the knowledge they need to improve. However, it is less effective when teachers do not have the knowledge they need to address issues in the classroom. In this quote, the assumption is that the teacher either has the knowledge or doesn't. And if they don't, then you can't be facilitative with your coaching, right? So descriptions like these can put different types of coaching into silos with firm boundaries. But as we started to talk about before the break, approaches to coaching rarely have such distinct, firm boundaries, because whatever approach we take should be heavily dependent on the needs of the person we're coaching, right? Dependent on context, dependent on our personalities and knowledge, dependent on what the teacher needs from their coach, right? So there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't a type of coaching with, like, firm boundaries all around it that you use in one instance and a different type of coaching that you use in a different instance. Ultimately, we agree with Dr. Knight that dialogic coaching is the most effective, right? Where we ask questions and share ideas. What we don't necessarily agree with is the way directive and facilitative coaching is sort of pitted against one another, which is why in this session and throughout the series, we're leaning a little bit more on Elena Aguilar's approach to coaching styles. So Elena Aguilar frames all coaching as dialogic, basically. There's not 3 different types, all coaching is dialogic, but we lean on both facilitative and directive stances as needed to get to the student level outcomes we're striving for. So in her book, she describes it in this way. Imagine that as a coach, you had an internal dial that you could fiddle with during coaching conversations. Turned all the way to the left, you become 100% facilitative, meaning that you don't share any expert knowledge, but rather support teachers to learn new ways of thinking and being through reflection, observation, and experimentation. Turned all the way to the right, you become 100% directive, meaning that you lead the conversation from your own expertise and may make suggestions, model lessons, or teach teachers how to do something. Instead of thinking about facilitative and directive as different types of coaching with one that's better than the other, they're actually 2 sides of the same coin, utilized in tandem to guide teachers, regardless of their years of experience, toward student outcomes. I'm going to give you a minute right now to read over the different stances that are listed on this slide. And when we say stance, we mean catalytic, cathartic, supportive, confrontational, informative, and prescriptive. Those are different stances you can take in a coaching conversation. Take a minute to read over those and then just stop and jot in your handout reflections for this question. What could be the benefit of looking at coaching on a spectrum as opposed to sort of 3 distinct types? We'll give you a couple of minutes here to read and reflect. So if we imagine coaching to be like a partner dance, then we can distill a coaching conversation down to 3 main movements: listening, responding, mostly with questioning, and stamping an action step or learning activity. In our last session, in session 2, we started with the end in mind, whether it's tied to implementation of HQIM or a push to increase student ownership during the lesson. We as observers will have an idea of the ideal change that should occur so that students get the learning experience they deserve. That's kind of what we harped on in session 2. But we know that thinking through an action step doesn't necessarily mean that you'll actually be delivering that action step directly to the teacher, right? It does mean you get to be more strategic with your listening and questioning, though. It depends entirely on how the conversation is unfolding. And we're going to get into that more in a moment. But regardless, as coaches, we should never be going into coaching conversations blind. That is the key idea we want to really double underline today. You may not directly be telling a teacher, here's what you should work on, right? But you shouldn't be going into the conversation with no idea of what the teacher should work on, right? You should know, based on what you've observed, what that teacher might need to prioritize, what skills that teacher might need to develop, but then the way you facilitate the conversation to get to that understanding could look really different based on the needs of the teacher. So today, in that spirit, we're going to work on those first 2 elements, those first 2 steps of a coaching conversation: listening and probing, and then responding primarily with questions, so that we can figure out what is the best path forward for this teacher. Do they need to be told what to do? Do they need more specific questions? Do I need to respond in a different way based on what I'm hearing from this teacher? I'm going to pause here for just a second before I pass it back to Nadia. Or no, I'm going to keep going. But I'm going to pause here for just a second to see if there are any questions, reflections, anything. Okay, let's dig in. We're going to hopefully add some specific tools, processes, approaches that you can add to your coaching toolbox here. All right, we have another quote from Elena Aguilar from her book, The Art of Coaching, that we'd love to have someone read out. Can I get Cindy from Maywood? Can you come off mute and read out this quote, please?
There we go. Skilled transformational coach is always listening to how someone thinks. How they think is what they believe. What they believe becomes what they do. We live inside the thoughts we develop, the beliefs we hold, the stories we spin. A transformational coach's role is to help someone recognize the stories they are living in, see the impact that living in those stories has for the client and the people in their lives, including their students, and then decide if they want to continue holding those beliefs.
Thank you, Cindy. So, like we see in that quote, a skilled coach is always listening, or how someone thinks, not just what they're saying, but how they think. The stance we take in our coaching conversations depends on the thinking that we encounter. So a couple slides ago, we talked about kind of fiddling with that dial in a conversation. And we wanted to name for you all what we have sort of observed to be general strengths and opportunities amongst this group when it comes to these 6 stances to coaching conversation. And this is just based on what we observed and heard at the site visits and kind of what we've heard you guys saying in these sessions. So obviously we have not seen each of you facilitate a coaching conversation. So this is just kind of based on what we've heard you say to us. So what we have observed is that you all know how to be prescriptive and informative when you need to be and when a teacher wants you to be. So when a teacher says, what should I do? You're great at telling them what they should do, right? We've also heard from you that you guys feel comfortable with being supportive, being encouraging, and motivating your people. It seems to us that based on what you guys have shared, particularly about the cultures of your schools, that it is super important to you and you guys put a lot of time and effort and thought into making sure that people are invested in whatever you're saying and doing. On the other hand, we've also heard you say things like, this teacher has some pretty challenging mindset concerns that have been hard to coach. Or my teachers have a lot of feelings or get overwhelmed by the new curriculum and are struggling to make progress as a result. Or some teachers lower the bar, and I don't want to say that explicitly and make them feel bad when I know they care about kids. All of these are valid challenges that I'm sure all of us have experienced in some way, shape, or form, right? Addressing these types of challenges requires taking cathartic, catalytic, or confrontational stances. Those more combination of like facilitative and directive stances. All of those stances are hard stances to take. I want to just name that. Like, these challenges are hard to address because having those tough conversations is hard and can be uncomfortable, right? But what we want to do today is lean into those 3 stances to give us a little more practice and space to really start internalizing, when I'm faced with these kinds of challenges, how can I approach that conversation? So we're really going to zoom in on the catalytic, cathartic, and confrontational stances today. The easiest way to kind of process all of this is through an example. So we're just going to jump into a scenario. Can I get Joe, you are on my screen. Can you come off mute and read out the scenario in the gray box? Sorry, there's probably more than one Joe. Joe from Winnebago.
Okay, yeah. Okay, you finished your observation and noticed that classroom culture is strong with students following behavioral tasks and transitions. While student ownership is definitely an area of growth, the bigger concern is that the teacher has swapped out the grade appropriate rigorous text from the curriculum with a text that is significantly below grade level. As such, you really hope to have a coaching breakthrough with essential content.
So take a second to, I see some people snapping. Yeah, we can all relate. Take a second to just think about, you don't need to put anything in the chat, but just think about the student level change you would want to see in this classroom. And then think about, if you had to, how would you communicate that change to the teacher in a way that's specific, time-bound, and measurable? So even though I'm just going to put myself in the coach's shoes, let's say I'm coaching this teacher, even though I might not actually be saying specific action steps directly to the teacher, I still want to go into my debrief conversation with this teacher prepared, just in case I have to. Just in case the teacher doesn't get there on their own through questioning, I have to be ready to say, hey, here's what we need to work on, right? So saying something like this is not super helpful. Go back to using the curriculum and the grade appropriate text. That's not measurable. It's not super concrete. It also feels a little dismissive, right? And it doesn't really leave room to get into, it doesn't address like why the teacher might not be using the curriculum. Saying something like this, develop a plan for how to get back into the curriculum in the next few weeks, is a little bit more specific, but it still leaves things really open and without opportunities to measure when we've made growth and progress, right? So here's an example that's better. By the start of the next quarter, in 3 weeks, sunset the current text with students and co-plan the first 5 lessons of the next unit with your coach. At this level, we now have a clear way to monitor progress and identify when a teacher has made gains so that we can celebrate that milestone together. So even though I might not be saying this action step directly to a teacher up front in a coaching conversation, I would want to go into this conversation with that action step in mind as something I want to work toward with that teacher. This seems like an easy enough shift, and ideally in that debrief conversation, I'm asking all the right questions and the teacher can kind of start to get to this action step on their own. And the vast majority of people we coach would probably get there on their own. But what do we do if they don't? What if they're stuck or struggling or simply just aren't arriving to the growth area on their own? So let's talk through the steps for what do we do in that situation. First and foremost, sounds really obvious, but we listen. Often we think of listening as sort of a passive act, but it really is an intentional act. And we're going to spend some time talking about a style of listening that Elena Aguilar calls reflective listening. What it is, I'm just going to call on 3 people. And as I click, there's 3 different things that I'd love for you guys to read out. We'll do Candace to read the first one, Mindy to read the second one, and Jim Glenn Hash to read the third one. All right, Candace, take it away.
Paraphrasing what the speaker says without overinterpreting, then inviting the speaker to clarify or confirm anything that might have been misunderstood or missed.
Parodying exactly what the speaker says back to them, which often shows that the listener isn't taking space to process what's being said, what it is not.
In addition to support of nonverbal cues, use prompts like, what I'm hearing is that correct? As I listen, I'm understanding that, is there anything else you want me to know? And I'm curious to hear more about.
Thank you, guys. So this is what reflective listening is not, and some ways to do it. And again, we're just going to jump right into some practice for this. So we're going to watch a 1-minute video in a second. And in this video, imagine this is a teacher. This teacher is going to be venting to you about something. So pretend you're this teacher's coach. As you're watching the video, take notes in your handout about what you notice the teacher is saying, so that you can paraphrase it accurately. The goal is not to give a solution. I want to be clear. This exercise is not to figure the problem out for the teacher. This exercise is to take notes to demonstrate to the teacher that you have listened and heard what they have to say, regardless of whether you agree or disagree. And you have a few reflective listening prompts in your handout that you can use to think about, how would you respond? Be prepared to share your reflective listening notes with a partner in breakout rooms right after the video. So you're just taking notes on what you hear using some of those reflective listening prompts. Questions? Check the chat. Okay.
I am really glad you're here. My gosh, what a day it's been. I'm at my wit's end with my department chair right now. We were supposed to be using our staff meetings to go over and co-design plans for our new curriculum. And it feels like we just spent half the time rehashing the email that went out to all staff already. I mean, I've been working weekends just trying to understand the curriculum better so I can have more engaging lessons for my kids, but they keep falling flat. I felt so much more comfortable with the curriculum we had last year. Dion down the hall, though, loves the new curriculum, and I keep meaning to ask her what she's doing or maybe see her in action, but I cannot find the time. And my poor English language learners, I know there's so much more I could be doing for them, but I don't have the time. I'm really hoping that you were coming today and could share some things that you're seeing working in other classrooms with other folks, because we're sure as heck not going to get to another department meeting on Thursday.
I'm going to pause for a minute before we go to breakouts to just give you a minute to capture your notes, identify the reflective listening prompts you would use. All right. In a moment, Abby is going to open breakout rooms for 4 minutes. And you'll share with a partner your reflective listening notes and the prompts that you used. Before we move on from this, I would love to hear from at least one person, and feel free to warm call your partner if you feel like they did a great job. Yeah, let's hear from at least one person to share your reflective listening notes. I'm seeing Kayla being called out in the
Yeah,
chat.
I was called out. So one of I don't have I can say my reflective statement, but what I was talking to Nadia and Chris about was I'm trying to get better at when I'm hearing a colleague or somebody I'm coaching or talking to or supporting. I'm trying to see beyond and hear beyond the noise, because for this gentleman, his noise was the frustration with the department time, the frustration with not being able to support his multilingual learners, but his actual issue was that he really needs and wants more time and the structure to plan and get comfortable with his curriculum. And his needs are not getting met. And that's what I like to focus on, is like, what needs are not getting met? Like, what is the heart of the issue? So I used to get so frustrated at like the noise. But now it's all about like just really focusing and processing. And I do this weird face when I process. So I ask people sometimes like just to not take, the RBF personally. I'm just trying to process.
Thank you so much for sharing. Would anyone else like to share what reflective listening prompts you landed on? All right, back to Nadia then.
Okay, so thank you all so much for that. And essentially, I heard similar things in other breakout rooms that I popped into, what am I listening for? And essentially, you are primed for this next slide, because ultimately asking questions will help you be able to better determine like what is going on after that initial listen. Because ultimately, when you slowed way down and you start to listen more closely, you will start to notice new things and more things. And so whether it's with little people, you're teaching young people, adults, whoever, our main questions tend to be the same, right? How do we motivate and influence people for positive change? Or if we're not seeing change, what's keeping them from making that positive change? And ultimately, the answer does lie in our analysis of what's preventing them in the first place. And so that brings us to Elena Aguilar's Mind the Gap framework. So here, this reminds us that there are any number of things that could be interrupting progress. And as coaches, we hold up mirrors to help teachers investigate some of these barriers and clear them away so that students learn in the way that they deserve, or that they can contribute to their community in the way that they really need to for success, right? So take 30 seconds. I want you to skim the table. So some of what we even heard Kayla set us up for with that video was what we were hearing was definitely a capacity gap, right? This person is feeling like the time or resources they have don't really meet their needs. And so even if you weren't using that word or that term or that phrase explicitly, that's totally fine. But, right, thinking about, well, what am I hearing and what's really going on? And this is like, oh man, I'm noticing a capacity thing. I heard Lucas and Amy having a conversation around something similar, like, oh, I'm hearing this like pressure, I'm hearing this need coming up with this teacher. Now I can start thinking about how to support that need if I can, right? But I'm also going to ask additional questions. I'm curious about this line about multilingual learners. So I'm going to investigate that a little bit more too. So all these things are allowing us to think through what's really at the root here and how can I further investigate to figure out what's really at play, so that way I could use questions that are either cathartic, catalytic, or maybe confrontational in order to address that gap that we're noticing. So we are going to do some practice. To set ourselves up for that practice, let's dig in and remind ourselves a little bit about the 3 stances. So first, we have our cathartic stance. Take a second, scan over that descriptor. So here we want to give people to just say more of what they're thinking to help us better understand the lens they're operating from. Right? What are those open-ended questions that I can ask that's like, I need to hear a little bit more about that, or I want them to express more about this. Let me think of some open-ended questions that can get me that response. Next, let's look at catalytic stance. So here we want to be a catalyst for change, right? Hence why it's called catalytic. So maybe the teacher is onto something that at its core is a pretty solid idea, but might not actually be what's best for students, and we need them to shift. We need them to change in some way. So now we're thinking about, what kind of prompts or questions can I ask to just kickstart them in that direction so I can just be a catalyst for them to arrive to their own conclusions for change. And then finally, confrontational. Honestly, the stance that tends to be the most challenging and the most uncomfortable. So read this one over. So these questions really do focus on something that is contentious, maybe a little problematic, maybe your alarm bells are going off, and I can't let this one slide. I'm not going to be I'm gonna wag my finger at you and say that's wrong, because ultimately we get that change by helping people self-reflect and get there. But I still have to ask a very pointed question that shines a light on that specific thing. So we are going to do some practice. Now, notice I did not give you any examples of cathartic, catalytic, or confrontational questions. That was on purpose. I just want to name that again. That's on purpose. We want you to kind of get messy. We're not here to give you answers, because all this completely depends on your relationships with people, the situation that you're in, the dynamics that you're encountering or experiencing. There is no list of cathartic questions that we can give you for every situation. So instead, what we did was we gave you 3 different scenarios. You're going to click a link and it's going to send you to a Jamboard. It'll tell you, for this scenario, ask questions that are more cathartic. For this scenario, ask questions that are more catalytic, and for this scenario, ask questions that are more confrontational. And you're going to take your best stab at questions that you think do that. Let's preview some of the scenarios that you'll have to be asking questions for. So we're using that same one, right? The teacher who swapped out the really rigorous text for one that lowered the bar. We're still using that scenario, but here are different things that you heard or could have heard during a conversation with this teacher. Go ahead and read over the 3 statements that you would be asking questions for. Awesome. So with that, let's go ahead and drop a link to the Jamboard. You'll have about 4 minutes to write questions. Don't overthink it. Just take your best stab at how would I ask questions from these kinds of stances if a teacher were to say this thing. Okay, have fun. All right, so let's go ahead and take a peek at some of these cathartic questions that folks raised. Oh, what does engagement look like to you? Okay, great. Go ahead. Namisha, can you go to the next one? Catalytic questions. Oh. What considerations led you to use this lesson from the HQIM resource? Did you look for any texts that had the same theme or area of interest in books that were more on grade level? What text did the curriculum suggest to use? Way more pointed. Very nice. Okay, next slide. Let's look at these confrontational questions. Let's see how confrontational we can get in Nebraska, y'all. Oh, from a parent's perspective, what concerns might I have only looking at below grade level text? Ooh, spicy, spicy, but professional and effective. Spicy. If your own child were in your classroom, how would you want to ensure that him, her, and classmates experienced high levels of success this year? Bring in empathy, spicy, spicy. How am I continuing to have the students learn 2 years behind their grade level impact their growth? Spicy. Okay. Love this. Love these confrontational stances we're taking. Let's go ahead and get back to the PowerPoint deck. Thank you so much, Namisha. Okay, so we also came up with some cathartic, catalytic, confrontational questions ourselves. This is by no means an exemplar, but these are just other examples to add to the metaphorical Jamboard, if you will. So yep, within a cathartic stance, we could ask something like, what did the engagement look like? Similar, very similar questions to what you all shared. Can I share something I noticed? And this could be a great time to cite your low inference notes. Ooh, well, you know, if you had a class of 25 kids, well, I did notice 10 out of 25 students were doing this, or maybe there was dope engagement, 20 out of 25 or whatever, right? So this is a great opportunity to also share some of your just low inference notes, super neutral data points. Now with catalytic, similar style, This one starts like just maybe one notch above. So just asking, do you know what the Lexile level was? Because maybe the teacher didn't even take the time to stop and ask or look at that, right? So I'm maybe making an assumption of like, maybe there's like a information gap. Maybe they didn't take that beat to do that additional step. So starting there, and if you're like, oh yeah, well, it's a 6th grade level, then that opens up a whole new bag of worms, right? Or can of worms. So very nice. Okay, now for confrontational. Just to make sure I understand, you are saying none of your students are capable. Also spicy. What would be the impact similar if your students never got grade level work, et cetera, et cetera? Honestly, I like some of the questions and on the Jamboard better. So that's great. Look at us, a little contributing to a brain trust. You all should, we're going to download this Jamboard and add it to the Google Classroom for sure. And we'll also email it out. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig in one more step. And it's great, you know, seeing us practice these different stances in this way, because ultimately it's really important that we are having in mind towards, well, what gap am I encountering? And am I really pushing that thinking? So this is the same Mind the Gap framework, but now it's in the form of a pyramid. Now imagine in a conversation with a teacher, they say this. I know student ownership is important, but Asian students tend to be so docile because of their culture. I just don't know if my class can have discussions about texts. That would definitely lean in the cultural competency gap of things. Or imagine a teacher said this. I shouldn't have to invest students in their learning or explain why learning math is important in their lives. I'm so frustrated. It feels like I'm constantly having to beg them to care. Right? Goes into that emotional intelligence bucket of things, like not understanding that youth are youth and we often do need to invest them. And that's actually completely developmentally and emotionally appropriate for young people. So thinking about statements like this, what would be the impact if a coach in their questioning stayed at that skill, knowledge, or even capacity will level? Think about that and come off mute. We'd love to hear from like 1 or 2 folks. What would be the impact if your questions never got to that confrontational sticky place, but instead kind of stayed at those upper levels of the pyramid even?
This is Molly. I would say you might not get to the root of what's going on or actual change to happen if you stay in that more superficial tier or lens.
Absolutely. Yes. Any other ideas? Great. Keep them coming.
Good morning, this is Allison. I think that you might miss the opportunity to really work on the relationship with the teacher. The teacher needs to be heard first, and expressing that frustration, acknowledge it, and then try to move them beyond that. But so much of what we do is based on relationships. And so I think that maybe pausing and recognizing that some of these statements reflect the teacher being vulnerable. And so you really do want to acknowledge that.
It's like you set us up for the next slide, Allison. You know what? With that, let's just go ahead and transition to Misha. So just like Allison said, there are oftentimes big emotions that come into coaching conversations. And yes, we do need to address those emotions and support people through those emotions without lowering the bar. Because think about the impacts, like, oh man, yeah, I'm so sad that you're frustrated that your Asian students don't want to discuss texts. And like leave it at that, because you're like, that's also kind of low-key problematic, actually high-key problematic. So we also still have to interrupt that mindset. We still have to interrupt that bias, because we can't have thinking like that in our walls as you're interfacing with students of that demographic. But we also do need to recognize that you have feelings, and as coaches, we need to usher you through those feelings so that you can get to the place of change, that mindsets and biases like that are not impacting your students moving forward. So like I said, Allison, you teed us on up. Let's go ahead and knock it out of the park. So same kind of situation, you know, we often have to respond, and we can still take these 3 stances. It just might shift a little bit. It might not necessarily be an initial question. It might be a response, a paraphrase. That's why we practice that reflective listening in the beginning. What I'm hearing is, or I'm understanding this, or let me make sure I understand you correctly. Am I, so in other words, we're doing these reflective listening strategies to make sure that we're plugging into what's being said. And when it's time to pivot or call out or address, right? So we still can be cathartic, catalytic, and confrontational in how we respond to some of these more troubling mindsets or big emotions that we might be encountering in a coaching conversation. So similarly, let's go ahead and look at some scenarios, right? Same teacher or same situation, swapped out the grade appropriate text with one that lowered the bar. And you're in this coaching conversation and you're encountering some big emotions. Maybe they say, I feel so trapped using the curriculum. I feel like I'm not allowed to express myself as a teacher. Maybe they say, honestly, the curriculum is really challenging, even for me. Sometimes I even struggle to understand the connection between literary devices and the themes of the texts. Or maybe they say, class has been so rough lately. These kids just hate reading and their families clearly aren't invested in books or education. We should just watch the movie. I feel so defeated. It's like a little emotion sandwich. You like, ooh, but there's feelings, right? You still got to address some of that stuff going on in there though. So here's our Jamboard. We didn't say it's going to be easy, but here's a link to a Jamboard in the chat. How would you respond to these statements in a cathartic, catalytic, or confrontational stance? Now, with that being said, we understand there was a little Jamboard kerfuffle before. You could also just jot these down in your handout and just label them cathartic, catalytic, confrontational with the things that you would say. You can copy and paste them into the chat because we would love for everybody to get some practice and get it out into the space. So we'll spend about 3 or 4 minutes here as well doing some practice and then come back together. For you all, I know Namisha has been bouncing back and forth to some of the pages. If you jot stuff, if you jotted anything on the on your handout and copy and paste them in the chat, by all means. But again, so fantastic, spicy, good responses that we're seeing here. And thank you so much for leaning into a lot of that practice. So let's go over some examples that we have shown. Okay, so similar in a cathartic way, we saw questions like, tell me more about this feeling of trapped, or what does that mean for you? Or where is there a particular place in the curriculum where you're feeling trapped? And yes, like the responses that we thought through or questions that we raised are fairly similar. So acknowledging, I'm sorry you feel this way, and I can tell you're feeling down. Are you open to unpacking how you're feeling about the curriculum in a non-judgmental space? I may be able to offer some really targeted help. So similar kind of thing, right? Showing that humanity as well. Because you're not, I know you all, you're not just going to drop the question on them, but just kind of give an example of a leading into that question. What are some things I might be able to say? In a catalytic sense, I'm noticing that maybe this teacher is having some like skill gaps, right? That's maybe what I'm hearing here, because they're like, okay, they are struggling with the content themselves, and that's coming up when I think about that mind the gap process. So I'm going to think through, well, I need this teacher to know that they have the ability to fill that skill gap, right? There are resources out there, but you know, I still need to help them process that big feeling. So it sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed by the content, which I know can be tough. If I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you want to dig into more of the literacy practices to strengthen your understanding. Is that right? Yeah. Oh my God, great girl. Let me help you out. Right. Depending on how you follow up. And with this last one, you know, I'm definitely seeing a cultural competency gap, right? I'm like, okay, yeah, big feelings, you're feeling defeated and all that. Definitely need to address that. But there's some biases, there's some mindset things going on as well that we need to interrupt. So feeling defeated is tough, and I'm sorry you're experiencing that. What I'm hearing you say, though, is that an entire community of people isn't invested in education and thus shouldn't get an opportunity to engage in the curriculum. We need to unpack that. Spicy. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and process. Let's spend some time processing this exercise. We're going to send you to breakout rooms and we'll come back and have a little bit of a debrief, process some of our feelings, our emotions, our reactions to these stances and these questions in this practice. But first, which of the 3 stances do you anticipate being the easiest? What do you anticipate being the most challenging? How does your ability to navigate all 3 stances ultimately impact students? And what were your biggest takeaways from this segment of the session? Okay, breakout rooms. Have fun. Okay, welcome back. Would love to hear some reflections from folks.
This is Kelly. I'll share what Candace, Kristen, and I talked about. Kristen and I shared that we're not very confrontational. So when we got to those questions of confrontation, that was really difficult. But Candace had pointed out like she's more like solution focused. Let's get to the point. I'm going to cut to the chase. So that helped me in my personality of, okay, I do think about those solutions too. So, and I'm more like strengths based. So when that teacher says these types of kids and this culture, they're not invested, I'm going to go towards, okay, but there are some strengths that we can pull from those students. So Candace's comment of get to the point helps me personally when I am dealing with a conflicting, because I even just reading those statements, and if I had a person in front of me saying that, Kristen and I both said, oh, you can read it in our face and our temperature rises, but I have to check myself, take a deep breath, and then say, okay, what's within our control? What is the solution? What are some strengths that we can pull from this? Because it's not all horrible gloom and doom. So that was good for me to take from that breakout session of, okay, we're going to go for the strengths and what is it within that we can control and be solution focused.
Yes, and I just want to say we wish we had another hour on this session because a lot of things that we had to rearrange and think about is, okay, well, how do we dig into building a coach's emotional intelligence? Because that's exactly what you named. Recognizing your body's cues, my temperature's rising, how's my face looking? I'm feeling a tightness in my chest. You're having a somatic experience in your body that's cueing to you, I'm having an emotional response. Okay, let me manage my emotional response so I can usher this person through what's happening to get to the ultimate outcome. That's a lot of emotional intelligence to have as a coach, and those are skills that you can build, right? And so we wish we had more time to even dig into that, but you know, just know that we know that too, and it's in the back of our mind. And one of these days we'll be able to have that, dig into that juicy topic with you all as well. But thank you so much for sharing that. That's super relevant. Anyone else?
I just want to toss in also, it can be helpful to have back pocket questions. Like in those moments, just have ready to say like, tell me more about that or something. If you know that you need a moment to like, oh, I gotta chill out before I say anything else. So it's helpful to have a back pocket. Just when you don't know what to say, you immediately say, tell me more about that while I collect my thoughts.
We had also shared about having that established understanding that there may be that awkward, quiet wait time in the room, and that would allow yourself to also gather and compose your thoughts to think of a thoughtful question, or also allow that person who made that statement to stop and think. It's like, oh, that did not come out the way I intended it to. That opportunity to not backtrack, but maybe restate in a more thoughtful manner.
Yes, absolutely. Darken the lines around that. Again, that reflective listening, a good repeat back can do wonders. So what I'm hearing you say is that correct? And oftentimes people be like, ooh, no, it ain't. Let me backtrack real fast. You know what I mean? But again, this is why we take these stances though, because we do have to be like, let me ask this really, let me shine the light on this thing that was just said, because we do have to address it, right? Because it would be remiss if I didn't. Okay, we could talk about this all day, but you all deserve a break. So let's go ahead and pause here, take 10 minutes, collect yourselves, and we'll be back at 11:18 Central Time. So, and for this video, it's really short. It's about 11 minutes. Practice video between a coach and a teacher. And as you listen to this video, think to yourselves, what was the impact of the coach's questioning on the teacher's reflections? How did the coach navigate between different coaching stances, and what examples stand out? And what evidence of listening did you notice throughout the conversation? Now, again, this is by no means supposed to be an exemplar or anything like that. This is not a perfect coaching conversation. I look back at it and I'm like, ooh, I would tweak this or switch that a little bit. So, but we're thinking about the gist and thinking about these 3 buckets specifically. After this, you'll have about 3 to 4 minutes in breakout rooms to chat about your reflections and see some of the through lines that we talked about today. Okay, let's go ahead and play that video.
Hey, Namisha. Hi. Thank you so much for letting me into your class today. It was really awesome to see you in action. Thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Yeah. How do you think class went today?
I mean, there were like a few hiccups, but I feel like overall it went pretty well. I felt good about it. I felt really excited about the lesson, and I feel like my kids were excited because of it, and they were really engaged for the most part. So overall, I feel like it went well.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think for the most part, students were on task. They were focused throughout the lesson. At any given point, at least 10 out of 12 of your students were actively tracking the page during the reading. And students, when called on to read, all read. Even your more reluctant readers, with a ton of encouragement from their peers, they were reading. So
We've worked really hard on building a community of readers.
I can really
Glad
see
to-
that. I can really, really, really see that. Awesome. So talk to me a little bit about the lesson itself.
So the original lesson, in my perspectives, well, the whole unit really focuses on the anchor text, but throughout the unit and in this lesson too, I decided to kind of use different supplemental texts instead, mostly because I just feel like the anchor text is really heavy. And I just feel like my kids are going to immediately be turned off by it, or like shut down when they see a text that's like a lot of words on a page. And this lesson in particular, just the theme that we're exploring, I feel like my students can make a lot more personal connections. So I wanted to bring in a text that would allow them to do that. And I don't think the novel does that.
Got it. So just to make sure I understand too, so you're saying this text that you picked definitely is more engaging, more relevant.
Yeah,
It
for sure.
feels like it is a better connection to your students and their experiences, which is why you picked it for these lessons in particular.
Yeah, I feel like they'll just be able to connect and get more excited with the theme through this text.
Oh, you know what? I think that says a lot about you as a teacher. The fact that you are really prioritizing student engagement in the text is really awesome, and it's thoughtful for you to be, considering for sure. So talk to me a little bit about what do students learn during the lesson?
I mean, the goal really was to have kind of just like an open discussion about the theme.
So, and how do you think that stuck with them, the theme? How do you know that students were able to articulate the theme, and how do you know how many of your students were able to articulate the theme?
I mean, we structure our class kind of in like it's really discussion based. Like I don't really give a lot of handouts or like writing because I want them to be talking about what they're reading. So we did the read aloud piece, and then we just had like a whole class discussion, and I kind of just gauge based on the types of things I'm hearing kids say.
Do you know about how many students during the whole class portion shared?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, so part of what is awesome about being an observer is that I can just be a fly on the wall, and I take notes and I keep track of what it is that we're seeing during the class time and like neutral notes, right? So in your class, you have 12 students, and throughout that like 15-minute or so discussion, there were about 4 different students that shared the majority of the time. I mean, and don't get me wrong, those 4 students were into it, but it was only 4 out of 12 of your students. How does that sit with you?
Not great.
Same here, yeah.
I think it's just interesting to put a number to it because I kind of just go off of how I'm feeling in the lesson and like the level of excitement I'm hearing from kids. But I mean, you're right in that I kind of let them guide where the conversation goes. So whoever wants to share, is excited to share, gets to share. But I'm realizing, kind of hearing you put numbers to it, that in that process, a bunch of kids aren't saying anything.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit more too about the text. Like, do you know what reading level it is by any chance?
I don't know. I just picked it because I knew I loved reading it as a kid, and it's just a text that I've loved teaching previously at my old school. So I love teaching it.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I just wanted to say, so I did some digging. I looked up the text, and the text is actually rated as a 6th grade level. Yeah. And yeah, I know. And given that this is a 9th grade class, I know how important it is to you. Like, you are so involved. Like, you really want to elevate student voice and make sure that class is really engaging for them. And I also know that it's important to you that students feel prepared for the next grade. But I guess my question is, or what I'm rolling around with right now, or like feeling the tension with, is we have a text that is interesting, engaging, but it's only 6th grade level. And if our 9th graders don't get opportunities to at least take a chance at reading challenging, high quality 9th grade texts, are they going to be able to now read 10th grade text? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How are you? Let's first pause there. Tell me what you're wrestling with, how you're feeling about that.
I don't know how I'm feeling, but I guess I wasn't really thinking about it beyond like my classroom in this year necessarily. Like I do want them to, of course I want them to leave 9th grade ready for 10th grade. But I don't know. I guess I was just prioritizing engagement and like learning to love reading, and didn't really think so much about the actual level of the text that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that makes sense. And I don't want to set my kids up to fail.
Yeah, I know. Of course not. Of course not. What you said earlier about the curriculum did not fall on deaf ears, right? The idea that maybe some of the texts don't always feel super relevant, or that they don't always speak to you, even as a person who loves to read, it's like a reading nerd, But I will say the curricular choices are really strong in terms of the rigor that we want our students to be engaging in and the things that actually get them ready for the next grade, the curriculum does do a really good job at that. I will say this too, I felt very similarly when I was teaching in Kansas City. I had to teach A Tale of Two Cities to my sophomores. And I remember when I first read this, I was like, you want me to go over Charles Dickens with my student? Like, they're going to find it so boring. But as I continued to read it and dig into it, I said to myself, like, this is a really challenging text, and they kind of do deserve a chance to at least give it a shot. Are there things that I can help them see themselves in and actually find connections to? And it became such a fun challenge. And that actually by the time we were done with that text, so many students continued to talk about how connected and how they didn't realize that something that felt so old could actually still be really relevant today. And it was pretty impactful. So I want to say, like, I wonder if there are ways that we could be thinking about the curriculum, given that it's such a strong resource to get them ready, that we could maybe think more creatively about how to really engage those students into the curriculum. What are your thoughts?
I'm not opposed to it for sure. Like I want to do right by my kids, but I also might need a little help figuring out how to make these texts interesting and accessible for them. Because when I looked at the text the first time around, like, I wasn't jazzed about it, but and I want to sell something I believe in, so I might just need some help figuring out how to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Here's what I'll do. First, I know that there are two other teachers who are teaching 9th grade and using your same curriculum, and they're having a really, really solid time with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to them and ask them, if I could take a couple of videos or maybe even set up a mini PLC, with us to have conversations about how are they teaching the curriculum and how are they getting success, so that you can also maybe learn a couple of things about what's working well at their schools. And then secondly, I know this accessibility piece, right? The text can be really challenging, and I know that our students are coming in with some reading challenges. I can actually help you plan some just-in-time supports or some scaffolds into the lessons to help them, actually be able to meet the expectations of the curriculum. How do both of those resources sound?
That sounds great. I'm willing to try.
Okay, so here's what I'm thinking in terms of timeline. You still have a couple of chapters left to this book that you're teaching. That actually gives us just enough time to, start to plan for the next unit in the grade level curriculum. So we'll finish off this text, keep doing what you're doing.
Okay, so I don't need to go back and start the novel that I skipped.
No. So what we'll do is we'll finish this up and we'll use the time that's remaining to prepare for the next upcoming unit using the curriculum.
Okay.
And then I'll get you in touch with those teachers and I'll help you plan some just-in-time supports.
Okay. Could I go observe one of those teachers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can totally make that happen. That'd be great. Yeah, I'll arrange the coverage for you. Yeah,
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you.
Look, y'all, there's 50 million things I would change about this video, so don't come for my neck. But we do want to open up opportunities for us to discuss and debrief in breakout rooms. So hopefully you have your notes. And we have our questions in the chat. What do you notice? What evidence of listening did you notice? How did the coach navigate between different stances? Of course, what could be done better. We know this plenty, but would love for you to have some time to discuss in breakout rooms. You'll have about 3-ish minutes, 3 to 4. Okay, have fun. Okay, welcome back. Let's hear some reflections. Namisha and I have very thick skin, so say what you need, but hopefully you found it useful.
You want us to share, Nadia? Okay. Well, I appreciate how you recognized and named the approximation that Nimisha's coming from a place where you're trying to do what's best for kids. I know that you care about your kids, like just giving that psychological safety first, that relationship before you kind of went into the coaching piece, and that you pulled out data and you used data when you needed to drive your point home, about I can't remember what it was, the number of engagement, how many students shared. Like you pulled that real data out so that she couldn't really argue with that data point. And then you went into the coaching piece.
Yes, other ideas or other thoughts?
We had talked about, it was evident the relationship between the coach and the teacher, that the teacher could really be quite vulnerable, and the coach recognized that piece and allow the teacher to have that conversation and kind of justify, well, this is why I did what I did. But then there was those confrontational questions that really was that springboard then to have that self-reflection and those guiding pieces. And during the break, we had some conversations that a confrontational does not always have to be argumentative, but it is those very thought-provoking comments that then make you kind of be up on edge, but yet are not threatening.
Yeah. And I'll name too, like one of the things that I think whenever I look at this video, I feel like my teachers would look at this video and be like, you were never that nice to us. I'm messing with you. But I would say I was very like complimentary. And that's something that I keep like thinking about as I rewatch this video. I'm like, oh, you were so complimentary. But I do think about the things that I was complimenting. A lot of things I was complimenting was the intention, the thoughtfulness, the consideration. I wasn't complimenting things like, oh, it's so great that you picked that text, because I knew I would have to come back and shoot the text down, right? But I would say, I see where you were going. I see why you were invested in that. I understand that's a really great place to work from and orient from. So I'm really complimenting that, not so much the actual instructional choices made. I'm appreciating that you want your kids to talk more. That's what I'm going to compliment. I'm not going to compliment how you did that, right? So I was like, wanted to make sure I named that too, because there is a difference there. Okay, so we need to keep moving so you all can get some practice in yourselves. So I'll voice over this pretty quickly. In your handout, you do have a little coaching cheat sheet, if you will, emphasis on cheat sheet, because ultimately you cannot script and plan and get in the weeds before heading into a conversation, because you have to be responsive to the person that you're coaching. You don't know what energy they're coming in with. You don't know what emotions they're coming into the space with. So ultimately you do have to listen and respond. But in the beginning, you can still go in with those things, right? You have your student level outcome in mind. Okay, this is the kind of outcome that I want to see. Here are the ways that I want them to reflect. Tell me more about what engagement looks like. Oh, how do you know? What did that sound like? What are the things I need to ask to kick off the conversation so that I can do the mind the gap questioning, ask the confrontational, catalytic, or cathartic things that I need to ask to move the needle. So I wanted to share this as a resource as you move into some practice. So just take, actually, let's go ahead and have, what do I have here? Kelly Frankenberg. Can you come off mute and read the gray box, please?
During this 4th grade math observation, you noticed that the teacher was using the materials from the adopted curriculum, but culture of learning was really challenging. The teacher would write one addition problem from the problem set at a time on the board, then ask all students to complete it on their whiteboards. The teacher would only move on when it seemed like enough students got the problems right. Because they spent so long on each problem, students sat idle while the teacher would help 1 to 2 struggling students, and the classroom would dissolve into chaos. The teacher sent 3 students to the office, and class only did 3 problems in 26 minutes. There were 24 students present.
Okay. So take a second in your handout. Think to yourself, what would the student level change be that you'd want to see in this classroom? Just go ahead and take a minute, write it down. If you had to deliver a thing or say a thing or think through, oh, I want to see this shift. What would that student level change be? Go ahead and write it down in your handout. Take about 30 more seconds, because here, even though, we would love to spend a ton of time practicing just identifying the change, what we actually want to prioritize is practicing some of those stances. So even if your change doesn't feel like perfect, that's totally fine, because the goal here is going to be to listen for, okay, what are some gaps? Let me practice some of this reflective listening. Let me practice some of these stances. So take about 30 more seconds. Okay, now for a little bit of practice. So in a sec, you're going to be sent to breakout rooms. There will be a teacher A and a teacher B, just for the sake of simplicity. Let's, teacher A, teacher B, a teacher and a coach. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's have the teacher be the person with the longer hair to start. The coach can be the person with the shortest hair, and then you'll swap. The goal, again, is to practice, how do I want to kick off this conversation? What reflective listening stems do I want to practice and use during this conversation? What gaps am I listening for, right? And then in response to those gaps, which of these stances do I want to practice? What kinds of questions do I want to ask? Or things I want to say to help them through and navigate that emotional response. Teachers in the breakout rooms, for sure, think about which gap are you going to lean in. Don't do anything too crazy, but pick a gap, right? And really stick and express that gap in your conversation. We're going to spend about 7 minutes. So think 3 minutes to practice, switch, 3 minutes to practice. And I know it's not nearly enough time, but we're just getting our feet wet with this process, knowing that there will be more time to come. So we'll be there with partners. About 7 minutes in breakout rooms. Have fun. Okay, so we'll absolutely name that was so fast and not nearly enough time, but we want to make sure, because of weather and everything happening in Nebraska and different regions, we want to get you out of here on time at noon. So thank you for your flexibility. But with that, are there any things that came up for you for whoever got to practice, were there things that came up for you during the practice? You're like, oh, I want to be thinking more about this, or I'm curious how I can do this differently, or this felt really good versus this felt challenging. So any initial reactions or thoughts to the practice?
I have a question maybe, just as somebody who is new to instructional coaching, when we talk about student level change, so clearly the coach has been in the room, or let's assume the coach has been in the room to do an observation and then they're having a reflective conversation afterwards. Does the coach go in with an idea of the student level change, or is it the coach's job to ask the right questions to have the teacher identify the student level change and then you go from there, or is it both?
I like to think of it as both. So if I'm going, like, let's use this scenario as an example, Namisha, if you go back to one slide, I know ultimately that there were some set up things, whether when it comes to culture of learning. So for first and foremost, too, in case this isn't clear, I'm very much so oriented to whatever tool I'm using to coach and move instruction, right? So I've looked at the tool, I've looked at the indicators, I'm using my data to say, okay, here are the culture of learning scores that I'm providing this teacher in my head, right? Our responses that I'm having. So, or this lesson that I observed. And so from there, I have a gist of, it would be great if the behavioral expectations were more expressly named, or the directions and tasks were more appropriately chunked and delivered to students, or what have you. I'm going in knowing the area that I want the teacher to focus on to move students so that we're not having classrooms dissolve into chaos. And while I'm there, I'm asking questions and probing to see, are they able to see the same challenges that I do, or are they going to say, well, those 3 kids I sent to the classroom hate learning. You know what I mean? Because if they say that, as opposed to being able to see, oh man, I don't think I set up the directions well. Now I'm like, oh, okay, let's go ahead and see if I can help you see the connection between setting up strong directions and minimizing some of these behaviors. And now we can set a goal or next step or action step around setting up clearer directions. Does that make sense? Okay. With that, let's go ahead and transition to the last 5 minutes we have together. So we make sure we have enough time to get you the link to the survey and some closing updates from Namisha.
Yep, we will share a link to the survey. You'll probably just have to take it right after the session. But before we do that, I do have one other quick announcement after this, but just in closing, we would love to see in the chat from you all 3 things. Something you're rethinking after these 3 hours together, something you're excited to try, and something you might need more support in. So take a couple minutes right now to share those 3 things in the chat. I'm seeing some amazing reflections in the chat. Keep them coming. If you haven't shared, really appreciate you all sharing here. Abby's gonna drop a link to the survey in the chat. You obviously won't be able to fill it out in 2 minutes, I don't think. So we'll also send it out via email right after this session. So just, we ask that you take 5 to 7 minutes sometime today before the session feels too far away to fill that out. We do look at all of that carefully, so please do take time to fill it out. One quick announcement before we officially close and let you go. You should have received a link to a survey about the academic diagnostic that TNTP has been facilitating with CSI schools. If you haven't already, please take some time today or tomorrow to fill out that survey. I believe it's in an email from Shirley. And it looks like what you see here on this screen. It's super quick. It's just asking you if you are a cohort 1 school identified in 2018 who is not yet exited. It's just asking you to confirm that, yes, you understand you will be getting an academic diagnostic. If you are a cohort 2 school, which means you were identified last year and you are not yet exited, then the survey will ask you to select whether or not you want a diagnostic. If you got one last year, we strongly recommend you get another one this year so that you can track the progress and the change in data. And then if you exited, yeah, we had, I think, 12 CSI schools exited, which is super exciting. And I see some of the exited schools still on this call. So thank you for being here to continue your own learning journey. But if you exited, you still have the option. You can still opt in to a diagnostic if you want a follow-up report from last year to see growth. If you have questions about any of this, please reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to get you answers. And with that, we will officially close out. Your only pre-work for next time is, as always, take your learning with you and then practice. Take what you learned today about coaching conversations and practice putting it into play. Reach out with any questions. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.